Further bills.
Committee substitute for House Bill 4187, Business Liability Protection Act.
Question where the House is the passage of the bill. Gentleman from the 15th, Delegate Foster, to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Bill 4187. Currently, West Virginia law is that any owner or person charged with the care and control of real property may prohibit the carrying, openly or concealing of a firearm or deadly weapon on property under their control. If a person then refuses to temporarily relinquish possession of the firearm or deadly weapon after being asked to do so, or to leave the premises while in possession of the firearm or deadly weapon, they are guilty of a misdemeanor. This bill does not change that. This bill does not change anything with regard to law in which forbids persons from having firearms in public K through 12 schools, education building, or grounds, nor does it change any of those exceptions. What the bill does do is to place in code language that prohibits a landowner, leasee, or other person charged with the care, custody, and control of the real property from prohibiting any lawful possession of a firearm when it is safely locked inside or locked to private motor vehicle located in the parking lot of the premises, on the premises, and when the firearm owner has the lawful right to be in that area. The bill also defines terms such as parking lot, motor vehicle, employee, employer, invitee, locked inside or locked to. It also provides the property owner may not inquire about the presence or absence of a firearm in their private motor vehicle or conducting an actual search of the vehicle. Additionally, the property owner cannot take any action against a customer, employee, or invitee based upon someone else's verbal or written statements about the customer, employee, or invitee having a firearm in their car, unless they allege the person owning the firearm has made terroristic threats. Any such private motor vehicle in a parking lot to check for the presence of a firearm can be conducted by law enforcement personnel. No employer can condition employment upon an employee's concealed carry permit status, nor can they make employee forfeit the right to store firearms in their vehicle as part of the condition of employment. There's no duty of care imposed upon the public or private employer for complying with the provisions of the bill, and the employer is immune from civil suit for actions or inactions taken in compliance with those provisions. This immunity does not extend to the actions or inactions not covered under the bill, and is not intended to expand or create any duty on that part of any public or private employer, property owner, or property owner's agent. The bill also allows the Attorney General to enforce the provisions of this bill and to seek equitably civil penalties of $5,000 per violation, or both attorney's fees and costs can be granted. Finally, the bill makes it clear that an aggrieved person under this section may seek to enforce any violations in a private cause of and may obtain the same kind of relief, including mandatory attorney's fees and costs to the prevailing party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there other members desiring to speak to the passage of the bill? Gentleman from 37th, Delegate Pushkin.
Thank you. Would the gentleman from the 15th yield for just a couple questions?
Yes.
Thank you. Did I hear you correctly? Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you say that a condition somebody based on a concealed carry permit?
That's correct.
So are we creating another protected class?
If you look on page 4, it's contained on page 4, line 74, and that's where the code section is listed, and that pertains to concealed carry permits. That's 6174 and 6174A of this code is where the concealed carry permit is.
That's the section of the code about concealed carry permits?
Yes, and that's where the condition of employment, no employer in subdivision 3, no employer may condition employment upon either, and then it goes into those two code sections.
Okay. So would that be, are we creating a protected class like under the Human Rights Commission?
I wouldn't say we're creating a protected class. I'd say we're we're protecting their Second Amendment rights.
Yeah, well, would it be creating a classic a condition where one couldn't be hired or fired? I believe that would might fall under the Human Rights Commission. Is that not so?
Yeah, there's no explicit provision to appeal it to Human Rights Commission or anything like that, so it wouldn't be a protected class.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Lady from 51st, Dr. Fleshauer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rise to speak in opposition to this bill, and I am, I'll speak a little louder for those in the back of the hall that can't hear so well. There are 4 reasons. This first reason has to do a little bit with the timing. I do not think this is the right time to dramatically expand access to weapons, including weapons of war, when on Valentine's Day, just 13 days ago, 17 kids and adults were gunned down in a school. We had our flags flying at half a mast, and I think you really need to look at this bill and see what it does. It basically says that guns will be allowed where they previously were prohibited on private property, on public property, on parking lots across the state, and there will be no exceptions. There is no exception for Mountaineer Field. There, even if somebody would be upset about whether we won or lost the game. There is no exception for the Coliseum. There's no exception for Target or Walmart. There is no exception for a munitions factory or a chemical factory. And just so long as those places, or no exception for the courts, where people are a little bit known to get upset even in the parking lot. Just so long as the entity, public or private, is an employer. That's my first reason. I think we are being totally tone deaf by passing this bill. My second reason is because this bill stands for the proposition that the Second Amendment is more important than any other amendment in our state or federal constitution, or any other provision. So, for example, that part about the right to life, liberty, and happiness, well, you can't appreciate life, liberty, and happiness if you're dead, like those kids in that school, you know, where somebody had an AR-15 in the your right to safety, which is mentioned several times in the West Virginia Constitution. You can't happen to have a gun. If you ask that question, there's a special new lawsuit where you can sue that employer. And also, it overrides the freedom to practice your religion. It would force churches and synagogues and meeting houses of Quakers to allow guns on their private property, even if it is against their religion. No exceptions here. And lastly, somewhat surprisingly, the bill is all about restricting what you can do on your private property. If you are an employer, you lose your right to control what is done on your own private property. The third reason that this bill bothers me is because it puts children and domestic violence victims at greater risk. By drastically expanding the number of places where guns will be allowed, where they were prohibited in the past, we don't have any provision in here about separating ammunition from guns. So we could have incidents with children And maybe some of them aren't being so well supervised these days because their parents are on opioids. We could have children playing in cars, playing with guns in cars, and they watch them on TV. They could maybe make a mistake like that little boy in Oregon who tried to pull the trigger, and when he didn't have the strength to do it, he used both of his thumbs and shot himself. That's okay here because it's so important that the Second Amendment take precedence. It's all right to increase risk to little children and domestic violence victims who are suffering from domestic terrorism in our country and other countries. They are going to not be able to feel safe when they go anywhere that has a parking lot, because the right of a person to be in a parking lot with their gun in their car takes preeminence over their right to be alive. The last reason is maybe the most persuasive, and that is it does not make our state more attractive to businesses. Do you really think if we want Google to ever come to West Virginia or Facebook, do you really think they would ever consider coming here if we said, oh, by the way, you cannot control your own private property, something that is also mentioned in the Constitution? You will be forced to submit to this law, which says you must allow guns in parking lots so long as they're locked in a car. And of course, they don't have to be separated from ammunition. They can just be sitting on the front seat or the back seat. You have to submit, and not only that, this legislature, which tries to stop lawsuits against businesses all the time, you will be subject to a new lawsuits where where they can have attorney's fees against you. Customers, employees can sue you if you even ask a question, or if they feel like their rights have been infringed to have their gun in their car when they go to your place of business, when they go to court, anything. So for all of these reasons, I'm voting no. And I urge the rest of you to vote no also.
The gentleman from 60th, Doug Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague from the 55. And I look forward to her support on the next right to life legislation that we work on. Would the chairman of the judiciary please yield?
Gentleman
I'm
yield.
sorry, I have another series of my silly questions to ask you, sir.
Gentleman yields.
I just want to make sure that I understand this. Under your understanding of the current law, can I currently legally access an AR-15?
I have no idea.
All right. Is there someone you could refer me to who could actually answer those questions?
My colleague and vice chair says you can buy an AR-15.
That is a relief because I own several of them. Does this bill make that weapon more accessible to me?
No.
No, okay. So the idea that this bill will somehow make, quote, weapons of war more accessible to anyone is not an accurate assessment of its intent or purpose.
I think the purpose of the bill deals solely with your right to keep it in the locked car or a secure location in your automobile,
so-
in the parking lot.
So this bill wouldn't make weapons of war more accessible to me?
I don't believe so.
Okay, sir. Can I currently legally access a rocket-propelled grenade launcher?
I have no clue.
No, sir, I can't. Thank you, though. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. So that's a complete malapropism. Weapons of war are not accessible and will not be accessible under this bill. If I were to come to your place of business and have a gun locked in my car. All that this bill would do is allow me to keep my gun locked in my car. That's it. That's it. It's the only thing this bill allows me to do. By the way, if I do come to your place of business, you can almost guess that there's going to be a gun somewhere near me. Perhaps, unless you have a sign on your front door telling me not to, on my body. Were I to take the gun out of my car, you as the owner or the person responsible for that particular piece of private property would have every right in the world to tell me to put it away. And I should comply. And if I don't comply, then I need to get off your property or you may call the police. It's that simple. That doesn't change in this bill. Were I to enter your facility with a weapon on me and you didn't want me to, you could say, hey, get out of here. And I would say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and I would do so. This bill changes none of that. Were I to brandish a weapon, in other words, actually take it out of the holster and point it around, that is illegal. It remains illegal under this bill. Were I to menace someone with my gun, that's illegal. It remains illegal under this bill. Were I to walk up and hit someone with my firearm, that remains illegal under this bill. Were I to shoot someone with my firearm, that remains illegal under this bill. Were I to use my firearm to rob you, that remains illegal under this bill. Were I to randomly shoot at parts of your facility, that remains illegal under this bill. So if the weapon is locked in my car, sitting in the parking lot, and I'm inside doing my job or inside doing business, that is the only thing this bill allows for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recommend everyone push the green button.
Lady from 35th, Duggan Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It should be no surprise to anyone on this floor that I'm rising in opposition to this bill. The property rights of employers are being destroyed by this bill, and I can only remember everybody on this floor when we were talking about co-tenancy. Everybody, or a lot of people, talking about the property rights of people, that the co-tenancy bill was destroying their property rights. Well, this bill actually does destroy the property rights of the employers of this state. Why are we doing this? We should have common sense. Common sense should rule this bill. What is the public purpose that this bill is seeking to address? None. We have a constitutional right to bear arms. And why do then we have to expand the right to have guns in parking lots, in chemical plants, in schools, in universities, churches, nursing homes, kindergartens? Why are we doing this in municipal parking lots? I think that having guns in parked cars does not make it safer. But if you think about the school shootings that we have seen over the past several years, how would guns in locked cars make it safer when the shooting is happening inside the school? How is that going to make any of us any safer? I want everyone to be safe, but having guns in parking lots does not seem to be the best interest of our state. It does not provide jobs. It does not attract new businesses. It does not provide teachers with pay raises when we're spending time on gun legislation like this. It does not ensure that our children are safe or that they are receiving the education that they deserve. This bill is not a good bill, and it should be defeated, and we can get back to the business of passing legislation that will make West Virginia a better place to live. Thank you.
John from the 10th, Duggan Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would the gentleman from 60th yield?
Gentleman yield.
Yes, sir.
Gentleman
For
yield.
my personal clarification on types of weapons that we keep talking about, you are an officer, and I assume a gentleman in the United States Army. Is that correct?
That's a very large assumption, sir. I am an officer in the infantry in the United States Army.
And with that designation, would you consider yourself an expert on military armament?
Expert's a large word, sir. I wouldn't consider myself an expert. I do know the small arms that are generally issued to the infantry of the United States Army, and then all
Called M16.
Yes, sir. Well, actually, we have moved that out of our inventory. What we use now is the M4. But yes, sir, I understand where you're going with this.
What's the difference between the M16 and the AR-15?
An AR-15 is the Armalite. By the way, AR stands for Armalite. It does not stand for automatic rifle, as some people seem to think. That's the name of the company that originally designed and built them for the U.S. Army. The M16 goes fully auto. You can actually hold the trigger and fire an entire magazine worth of rounds, although I wouldn't recommend it because you'll melt your barrel down.
And the M15? Or the AR-15?
The AR-15 is a semi-automatic, which means you pull the trigger, you fire a round. You pull the trigger, you fire a round. And what's critical about that is not only are you only able to fire a round every time you pull the trigger, but there's a recoil, so every time that you want to go back on target, it takes a second or so to get back on target.
Does the military use AR-15s?
No, sir. We use M4s, and frankly, good point. The AR-15 itself, the civilian version, is not a weapon of war.
So much of the discussion we hear today about the AR-15 being a military-style weapon is just not so, is it?
No, sir. It's a complete malapropism.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
John for 36, Dr. Robb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We talked about this, of course, yesterday on second reading whenever we had an amendment that would have taken churches and church parking lot and church property, church parking garages out of the bill. And that amendment was not passed. 14 members, I poison pill in the bill. There is no way that it is constitutional for us to impose upon any arms, the use of arms, or anything else. I'm going to ask permission to address the congregation and indicate to House of Delegates bill prevent that. And I'm sure somebody may stand up and say, well, but if they don't want to park in our parking lot, couldn't they just park next door? And I'll say, yes, that's true. I don't think there's any inconvenience. But without the amendment to exclude churches, we have imposed on the churches our ideas about what their beliefs and their activities and their religious practices should be. That's wrong, ladies and gentlemen. That is unconstitutional. And I think outside this building, it will be very apparent and obvious to all people who have deeply held religious beliefs concerning firearms. The bill cannot be corrected, I don't think, by a court reviewing its constitutionality by just saying, well, we'll not let you enforce that on churches. Problem is that the whole concept of the bill is that no private property owner can exclude firearms from their property if they happen to be an employer in this state. Now, whenever you read the Federalist Papers or look at the Founding Fathers' philosophy of government and what government can do to you and can't do to you, I don't think there's anybody that can find any Founding Father that would support the idea that private property is not sacred under the Constitution, that private property is subject to the state's will to take over and control that private property. I can't think of any Founding Father that believes that private property would be subject to a bill like this. Ladies and gentlemen, I really encourage you to think about what you're voting on in terms of your religion and respect for the religion and beliefs of others, how fundamental that is to who we are as Americans, as a society, and then step back. If that's not good enough, look at the fact of what we're doing to private property rights. This is a horror. It should be voted down. It's a bad bill. It's easy to defend to anybody who believes in the Second Amendment that this bill goes too far, that we as a people, as Americans, cannot allow private property to be subjected to this kind of state interference. Mr. Speaker, thank you. I encourage the members to vote against this terrible bill.
Lady from the 50th, Doug Longstreth.
Would the delegate yield for a question, please?
Gentleman yields.
Is it now the law that if you have a concealed carry weapon or license, 21, you can go into any facility with that as long as it's concealed? We're talking about Walmart, wherever it may be. Is that the law today?
No, there's areas that are prohibited.
What areas would that be?
If the owner of the property says that it's prohibited,
Okay.
and marks that it's prohibited.
Okay, but you could go into a public place with a concealed carry. Is that right? That's what I was asking.
Yes, you can, depending on what that is. Of course, you can't go into schools and stuff like that.
Absolutely. We have some exceptions, such as the schools, which is appropriate. But this is only dealing with locked in your car, no matter where you may be, as long as it's locked in your car and it is not loaded. Is that correct?
As long as it's locked in your personal vehicle.
Does it have to be, are we allowing them to be
or locked to? And locked inside, locked to means the vehicle is locked or the firearm is locked in a trunk, glove box, or other compartment, or the firearm is locked in a container securely fixed to the vehicle, or the firearm is secured and locked to the vehicle itself by use of some form of attachment or lock.
Okay. Do we have a code where there is something such as that you must, if you keep it in your car, that it must be, the magazine must be removed and it must not be loaded? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you very much.
John from the 48th, Doug Quinta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Had I been in my seat on vote 2982, I would have voted in the affirmative. Also, 4016 in the affirmative, 4154 and 4166, and I would have voted against on 4014. Thank you.
The objection, gentleman's preference, had he been present, will be reflected in the journal.
I just want to clarify the consideration of private property here. My private property is parked on your private property. My gun, which is my private property, is secured within my private property, which is on your private property. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
John from the 27th, Doug Schott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had hoped that I would be able to vote for this bill. I have, I think, in every case in which a Second Amendment bill was before us since I've been serving here, voted in favor of it. One possible exception dealt with a bill that I voted on an amendment that would require training, and that probably was perceived as not necessarily purely pro-gun. But in this case, I can't in good conscience vote for this bill. I just think the price is too great. You know, what we do here is balance competing interests, balance rights, and in this case, we focus on two fundamental rights. The Second Amendment constitutional right, private property rights, there's some conflict here. If I have a piece of private property and I happen to operate a business and I don't want weapons on my property, this bill would require me to allow that to happen. I was concerned about this enough that I did some research over the weekend and last night. There are 22 states now, best I can tell, that allow some form of this bill, parking lots. I tried to read as many of those bills as I could, and I think I got through about 16 of them. And basically what I was looking at is how that balance was struck between private property rights and Second Amendment rights. Some states, well, let me just say, I did not find a single state that was less friendly to business than the bill that's before us. In every case, there is some consideration given to exceptions based on safety or other concerns. For instance, some states actually carve out a specific type of location that they exempt. Georgia, North Dakota expressly carve out correctional facilities and jails. This type of bill would not require in a correctional facility that you allow a visitor who's visiting a prisoner to bring a gun on the property. The bill before you does not have that exemption. For instance, Kentucky. Colleges, universities, post-secondary schools, all exempted specifically. Other states take a more general approach to it, and they say, for instance, if you have a specialized parking area that's secured, the public to take that approach. Safety is a focus in many places. I know we all know what happened with Freedom Industries here. If you were around in 1984, you remember what happened in Bhopal. Is our competitive environment. Let me read to you. If you'll remember at the start of the session, we had a report from WVU Business and Economics. And they gave us this printed and bound version, and on page 19, under the title or the subtitle, West Virginia Outlook, they talk about manufacturing. And let me just read to you what they say. While machinery manufacturing is expected to register the fastest rate of growth over the next 5 years, the state's chemical industry will account for the majority of the sector's overall growth during the outlook period. Part of this optimistic outlook for the chemical industry stems from the ongoing development of natural gas resources in the Marcellus and Utica shale plays, particularly the construction of at least one ethane cracker plant in the region. In addition to providing chemicals manufacturers a low-cost feedstock, projects such as the ethane cracker further develop the critical mass of industries because they enable conversion of the raw material, ethane, into compounds, ethylene and polyethylene. Louisiana, all of those are those Gulf Coast states where this product is currently being exported. Texas, I mentioned the statute there. Texas expressly excludes manufacturers of chemicals and the refinery, oil and gas refinery business. That's expressly excluded. The statute, the amendment that was patterned after that, and unfortunately it failed. Both Louisiana and Mississippi are more broad than that. They allow any facility that has a secured area that the public does not have access to, whether it's chemicals or otherwise, to be accepted from this for safety concerns. We are going to be competing with those folks for where this raw material, this ethylene, if we have this restriction. We will be less competitive if we don't allow those people to provide for a safe workplace and protect the public around them from any type of peril that may occur. Had this bill mirrored those, if this bill mirrored Texas, or Louisiana, or Mississippi, I could have voted for it. I could have voted for it. I don't know why the NRA, which fought for the Texas law exactly the way it was, has flip-flopped on that issue. I have no way of knowing that, but they have. Today, we have the collective courage to say this bill goes too far. This bill goes too far.
The gentleman from the 15th to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a gentlelady from the 35th asked the question, what's the purpose of this bill? The purpose of this bill is basically to protect somebody's personal property, being their vehicle, and their Second Amendment rights. And we have many people in this state to decide that carry because they want to protect themselves. And many times that involves carrying to work. Well, many of the people in this state have been prevented from being able to carry to work, essentially being disarmed throughout the course of the day because they can't have the gun locked in their vehicle. They don't want to carry it at work. They just want it in their vehicle so that they have access to it, depending on where they may go after work on their way home. The other thing that this bill does is also, we mentioned the chemical and gas industry, and that's going to be a growing industry in our state. Well, I would assert that was an issue that by exempting the chemical and gas industry out, we're removing those protections of the Second Amendment and the personal property of the vehicle to the person. And if this is something that is going to be a growing industry in the state, well, that means that this is going to be offering this protection of this bill to more people. And what I would urge passage of this bill specifically for the interest of somebody's personal property rights being their vehicle and their Second Amendment right to carry. I would urge passage.
Request for the House is the passage of the bill. Those in favor of passage will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Clerk, prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 85 ayes, 14 nays, 1 member absent, not voting. The majority of members present having voted in the affirmative, I declare the bill passed. Clerk, please report the title.
Committee substitute for House Bill 4187.
Are there amendments to the title? If not, the title as read by the clerk will be and remain the title of the bill. Clerk, please communicate the action of the House to the Senate and request concurrence therein. Further bills.